Hey, all right. Thank you so much, Clinton. Okay, hi. I am Bridget Kromhout. Today, I think probably most of you have been listening to exciting things about Kubernetes and other computer things and Kubernetes, because that's where we are in the hype cycle right now. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to do a whirlwind tour through a whole bunch of tools in the Kubernetes ecosystem. I have to use the obligatory second slide. This obligatory second slide is also my test pattern slide. I can tell if there's distortion on the screen or overscan or anything. I live in Minneapolis, and if I don't look familiar but I sound familiar, you may have listened to Arrested DevOps before. I'm the head organizer of DevOpsDays, actually. More on that in a minute, because that's kind of fun. And I work at Microsoft, and that's pretty much the only thing about Microsoft in this, even though we do contribute to a lot of the open source projects I'm going to talk about. And quick word on DevOpsDays. This is the 10th-year anniversary, and I think this is a testament to scaling. Organizations like, Peter and Clinton and everyone here jumping in and building something local in their area is why we've scaled like this. That and documentation. People did say, what happened between 2015 and 2016? We wrote docs. So if you only take one thing from this talk, like writing documentation lets you scale a lot more than just doing it yourself does. Okay, so if you are looking for exciting tools, you may go and look at the CNCF landscape. And then you might back away slowly, horrified, and say, absolutely not. Maybe I'll wait 6 more months. Maybe it'll be smaller. Spoiler alert, it will not be smaller. But they do also have the CNCF trail guide. It turns out that it kind of looks a little bit like this. And it's not anyone's fault that it's becoming that complex. I mean, it might be that people want to launch their own project instead of contributing to a project that exists. Please don't do that. Look and see if there's a project that you want to contribute to before you launch something that is almost but not quite exactly what 8 other people have already done. But I also think that we do have this tendency towards proliferation and chaos when left unchecked. So a little bit of structure in the space is not terrible. And the cloud native trail map, which again, I'm still confused by the term cloud native, but because really, did any of us start here? No. I mean, maybe some people started their careers completely in the cloud, but some of us are old and spend a lot of time with data centers, being really cool, being really happy that someone else is running the cloud now. But this particular trail map, this is only the first 6 points or so. It goes on from here. But I figure I will try to narrow the scope to just talk about a few tools in this space. First, I have to break it to you that containers are a lie. I'm so sorry. Alice Goldfuss, I think, put it really well at DevOpsDays Minneapolis this year when she was like, they're just processes that are stapled or nail gunned together. They are C groups and namespaces. And so if you're like, I don't know what those are or care, that's fine. But basically, your containers are features of the Linux kernel. They are not magical. They are not new. They've been in this space a while. If these were your textbooks in school, then you are as old as I am. And what I will say is that it's very easy for us to forget that there's been a lot of work in this space already. And if you jumped in 2013 with Docker, that's awesome. That is not the first implementation of containers. It definitely is one that made it more usable than, say, LXC for the vast majority of us. I will say that while I am not from Philly, I used to remote to a company here. Some of my former colleagues are here. Some of my former colleagues run this event. And what we discovered is that containers are super useful. And they also don't necessarily solve all your problems, turns out. There are still humans, who knew? I also think that we tend to forget that just because we add something like microservices, that doesn't mean that we've actually made it easier. Sometimes we've made it harder. We've made our debugging harder. We've made our local development environments harder. And one particular open source project that actually just came out last week that some of my colleagues and some other folks are working on is an attempt to help with that. And I am totally going to look at my notes because I don't know enough about dapr yet, though it does have a very dapr top hat. My colleague Ronan designed that. But the idea is an event-driven runtime that makes it easier to have building blocks for those microservices. So again, like if you've done any of these distributed systems where you cobble together a lot of things, you probably know that it's not necessarily consistent between orgs or even between projects inside your org or between teams. So if that is a problem that resonates with you, this might be an open source project that is right for you. The idea is to be able to run things either on the cloud of your choice or on edge devices and still use a consistent tool chain in any language and framework of your choice. So that's worth looking at if you're in that place in your containers and microservices journey. Okay, CI/CD, there's a lot of tools in this space. There are some vendors you can talk to here at the conference. I would say, I mean, I work for Microsoft, so we obviously are pals with GitHub, but this is one of those spaces where it's not necessarily important what you use, but it is important that you're using something. So if in your organization there is proliferation of tools in that space, that's a problem to solve before you try to solve anything else. This isn't necessarily all in chronological order, but it sort of is. I mean, you probably need some containers, you probably need some CI/CD. Okay, you're saying, at this point, everything is simple so far. Yeah, and so then it gets a little bit more complicated because here we're 5 years in to Kubernetes. And if you're thinking like, wait a minute, what do you mean 5 years? Yeah, the initial release was actually in June 2014. And if that horrifies you and you start immediately scrambling and getting on Slack and telling somebody how far behind you are, like, it's actually fine. This is a good time to be starting to use Kubernetes. And I know when people were doing show of hands before, I'm going to ask for a quick show of hands again. How many people have looked at or played with Kubernetes in some way? I would say half the room. How many people are legit, actual facts running Kubernetes in production at their workplace? 8 people, maybe? Yeah, so about what you expect. We're about at that place, which is to say there are a lot of tools in this space that you might not have tried yet, or you might have completely tried, but you didn't know that they were applicable to this. So I will point out Terraform has some really cool stuff for Kubernetes. And that means that you can deploy your Kubernetes, like clusters, pods, services, et cetera, and then you can use the providers to actually manage them. So again, we have HashiCorp people here, so you should talk to them, but it's worth looking at for your Kubernetes across all of your public and private clouds, if you're interested in that. Just like Seth, I do work for a cloud provider, so this is my one product-related slide, but not really, because the important point here is that if you're using a managed Kubernetes provider, and I strongly recommend you do, if you don't work for a cloud provider, you probably have better things to do with your time than be a cloud provider. So it's probably worth looking at the managed Kubernetes choices at the cloud of your choice. And the main difference between running your own Kubernetes the hard way and being like, these CVEs are so fun to deal with, versus working with a provider is you don't control the control plane, but you do control your nodes with all of your container runtimes and kubelets and everything else. And if you're thinking to yourself, those cloud providers just want my money, and I definitely don't want to be running a whole bunch of idle infrastructure. Excellent, you are correct. And there is another open source project you should look at called Virtual Kubelet. And your various cloud providers do have implementations of this, but you can just look at the open source project to see what this can do for you. This basically takes the chocolate of Kubernetes and the peanut butter of serverless and puts them together in a delicious, highly caloric, possibly, you might be allergic to it, but hey, deliciousness of you can have your serverless and your Kubernetes. This, by the way, is your secret weapon. If you're the person trying to do Kubernetes in your organization and someone else is saying, but serverless, you can say, yeah, we can totally do serverless. All this does is it allows you to instantiate Kubernetes nodes that are ephemeral, that you don't need to run all the time. So you don't have to have a bunch of worker nodes sitting there idle in your cluster if you don't have work for them. The on-demand part, I think, is what people like because they realize that it saves them money. Okay, another thing to look at, and this is the other open source project that literally came out last week, so I have to look at my notes because I don't know a ton about it yet, but this is, in a lot of our organizations, everyone starts out with the, we are DevOps and everyone can do everything, and that's not necessarily realistic if you work at enterprises that have like governance or customers or money or any of those things that lead you to actually wanting separation of concerns. But at the same time, you want to have good working relationships across the org. And so having our tech and the tech models that we're using help with that is great. This particular OAM, the Open Application Model, is useful for considering that there are going to be people who are going to run the infra, there are going to be people who write applications, there are probably going to be people who do something in between there, and it would be nice if they could communicate via tech with each other. So if you look at the Rudder application of this, or sorry, the Rudder reference implementation of this, it just adds a bunch of annotations. If you're using, again, this could be used not just in Kubernetes, you could use it with all of your V whatever, but if you're using it with Kubernetes, you basically just add a bunch of annotations to that YAML. I do feel like when I talk about Kubernetes, I have to put a content warning in there for YAML. I'm so sorry if YAML upsets you, but there's definitely going to be a lot of YAML in Kubernetes. Okay, but this allows you to say, this is some restrictions, or this is some information about this particular stuff. Okay, so moving on. Helm is a package manager for Kubernetes, and Helm v3 is coming out right at the end of this month. If you look in GitHub, you'll see we've already switched over to v3 as the master branch, and we're on, I think, beta 5, and we're going to go to the release candidate soon. And this is interesting because when you are running and operating software in your Kubernetes cluster, it can be a little bit annoying if you want to, say, run Prometheus, John talked about, or just other people have software that they've already packaged up and gotten to work. And you're like, well, I mean, I could start from a tarball, but I may as well install something a lot easier. And so Helm works much like apt or yum, just to install software. I will say there is one lie on this slide, which is share can't turn back time, and neither can you. Rollbacks are a damn dirty lie. So if you would like to roll forward, you can use Helm to install an old version that you know works. But I make no guarantees about your state. So that is my hashtag ops life warning about rollbacks. Do not believe them. It does make it a lot easier, though, to see where you are in terms of what you have installed. Okay. This is actually a quick interlude. I want to show you something. If you look at error messages like this, they might make you sad, and reasonably so, because they're terrible. And can you tell me what's wrong here? Because, I look at this and go, So if you are using Helm, you can actually use a pretty great open source tool from Gareth Rushgrove called kubeval. And the nice thing about this is it can give you much better error messages for that sort of, you get that sort of word salad and you're like, what is happening? So this is a lot more, less verbose and more clear. I'm wondering if anybody wants to shout it out, if they can see what was wrong with our Helm install command based on the error message here. Exactly. It's like, oh, we should have used an integer. We shouldn't have spelled out the string 2. We should have used the integer 2. It's way more obvious when you're using kubeval. And if that was obvious to you, nobody shouted it out, but if it was obvious to you before, cool, you are much better at reading error messages than I am. But this makes it a lot easier to see what's wrong with your deployments. So if you're using Helm, I recommend this particular open source tool. Okay, so if you're thinking to yourself, I know you said there would be YAML, but I hate YAML, and I want to work not with YAML. One of the things about Kubernetes is that there are these controllers that just reconcile, the desired state. So it's declarative, and it's just always going to have whatever you told it to have. but many times you want to do something triggered by an event. So Brigade is a good tool to look at, and it lets you write in JavaScript, which is great if you're sick of YAML, and it lets you trigger events based on things that have happened in your cluster. So that can be useful if you're trying to have things happen in your cluster that are triggered outside of just, we always want it to be this way. Okay, CNAB is an interesting spec that we have a couple of examples of. This, in general, it's if you're saying, well, Helm is great, but I have a lot more that I need for my applications than just the application configuration itself. Like, perhaps I need to have a whole bunch of other things bundled up with it. Duffel is a reference implementation of CNAB, but it's very simple. If you want to see a fuller version of it, take a look at Porter. So the reason this is useful, if you have these particular sets of needs, is say for a particular application, if you want to spin up the, somebody spin up a dev cluster or whatever, and you need to have like a database and maybe a session store. You need a whole bunch of Redis, which you're definitely not going to permanently store data in because sadness. But you need to spin up a whole bunch of stuff, and this lets you define this application needs all these things in order to be set up correctly. This is the sort of tool that can shorten your time to set up a dev environment as well as all of the other environments that you need. So that's worth looking at, and it's worth looking at specifically because if you are working in air-gapped environments, or if you're working in other regulatory sort of environments where you need to be able to define exactly what's going to happen, Porter lets you do it consistently. So, okay. It was nice to see some other people shouting out, like Rosemary talked about VS Code, and that was awesome because I have colleagues like Ivan in New Zealand who works on the Kubernetes extension for VS Code. So this is all open source stuff, and it lets you click and introspect your clusters in a way that might be a lot harder to do without it. So if you already are using a VS Code environment, you should definitely take a look at, and you're using Kubernetes, you should take a look at the Kubernetes extension just because it doesn't just work with, even cloud provider Kubernetes. Like you can use it with Minikube or Kind or whatever. Can make your environment a little bit easier, or sorry, your experience of what you're using a little bit easier. Okay, so that was a lot of stuff. It's just, there are, I assure you, way more tools in the Kubernetes ecosystem than that, but that's a few that, my team and other people that I know work on that are pretty helpful. In contrast, I'm not going to show you a ton of observability tools, because again, there are a lot of tools in this space. For example, the OpenTelemetry project that has brought together a number of open source tools is worth looking at, but I guess what I'll say about this is when you're talking to your vendors that you're working with about your observability tooling, make sure that you have the ability to look at your live systems and not necessarily just reports or dashboards that were created based on last outage. Because we all know that you create a dashboard based on whatever went wrong one time, and it isn't necessarily what you need in the future. So it's good to make sure you can do this in an iterative fashion. Okay, and I feel like service mesh and proxy and discovery space is a place where I see a lot of exciting new tools, but also a lot of uncertainty. And I think one of the things that's really good about this is a whole bunch of vendors and players in the space have gotten together to do SMI, to do the service mesh interface, say that 3 times fast, like a standard, which is to say, if you want to use, Istio, or if you want to use Linkerd, or you want to use any of these service mesh tools in this space, if you want to use Console Connect, whatever, you want the ability to use the one that's right for you, for your project, and not be locked in. Nobody likes lock-in. So this is a standardization so that you can use whichever ones are right for you. Okay, and the policy space is another space where there's a lot of tooling, and I think that it's valuable to look at, again, like CNCF governed, et cetera, tools in this space. OPA is worth looking at, Open Policy Agent, is worth looking at specifically because there are a number of implementations, and I'll show one brief demo and then and talk about the differences between some of these. But Open Policy Agent basically lets you define policy in code, much as you would do with like some specific vendors projects, so that you can, again, make sure it's consistent between teams. And I think this is one of the communication things in this DevOps space is like, we want consistent communication between teams, but we also want to check that consistent communication into GitHub. And we can do that with something like this. So let's look at Gatekeeper, one specific community-driven approach to policy in Kubernetes. And colleagues of mine actually started, this is interesting because they started this project as something Azure-specific, and then realized they were solving a more general problem. So my boss, Lockie Evenson, and some other people from Microsoft actually took this out into the community and open sourced it and built it in the open, and then built an Azure-specific implementation. And I think this is when big companies are doing open source, it is useful to take that community-first approach, because it really your community and your customers prefer when stuff is out in the open rather than, you know, specific to a given company. Okay, so I'm going to start this, if I can start it. I feel like, here we go, yeah. So if you work at a company that has, you know, customers or money or whatever, you probably have regulatory requirements. Like in this specific case, we want you to only use the trusted internal container registry. We don't want you launching things from elsewhere. All right, we can do this with Gatekeeper. We can say you have to use things from this specific repo, and you can't launch things in your cluster that don't have that repo. So say you apply a policy like that, hey, that's cool. As long as this cluster exists, that's going to remain active on this cluster. As we all know, usually people forget or didn't read the memo or didn't read the email and aren't positive why something breaks. Great, Gatekeeper applied to your cluster is going to give a pretty clear error message. Like, oh, you're not launching this from the right repo. Okay, if we define something, if we define an image that comes from the right repo, then it'll work. Great. This is a very, obviously this is a very simple example, but I think it's useful for the point of it's not that hard to apply some pretty consistent policy, whether it's you have to use something that has these permissions, you have to use something that has these, you know, your images originate in this specific way. Like sometimes people hear policy and think, oh, everything is going to be terrible, but it doesn't have to be. Like we can do it pretty simply. So with Open Policy Agent, and this is pod security policy, Gatekeeper. On the server side, it's actually not that difficult to apply some of these. The difficulty, I think, comes in with that developer who didn't know that they were pushing something bad, but didn't really have a good way to test it locally. And so this is another great open source tool from our friend Gareth, who works at Sneak Security, and it's ConfTest. And so this lets you look at policy, but locally, like not pushed up on your Kubernetes cluster yet. And so that's kind of an example of, these are open source tools that I want to highlight because I'm not sure if people would have necessarily seen them or used them or seen why to use them. And like this is so that you can check your policy before you send anything to your cluster. And oh, it's written in the same rego that, you know, that OPA uses. So, which, by the way, I had no idea what that was and I had to look it up. And I guess rego is a language, it basically is an extension of something called data log, which has been around for a while, but it provides kind of a consistent way to communicate policy. So, all right, cool. So here's an example of what ConfTest does. And this is using it with Helm, though it can be used with other things. Can anybody tell me why is this failing? Why is this deployment failing? Yeah, so people who have used Kubernetes before might have run into this problem where, by default, we heard from Seth Vargo about how Kubernetes security defaults are a little bit dire, and by default, the resource constraints are a little bit dire too. So Kubernetes is perfectly happy to let you use up absolutely all of the available memory and all of the available CPU on your cluster, even the stuff that, say, etcd needs. So this doesn't go well, generally, and your cluster will fall over and everyone will be sad. But you can govern this by just saying, we are setting limits of when we are launching this specific application, we're gonna set limits that if it's using more CPU or more memory than this, we're gonna care. Like, we at least wanna know, right? Like, do we have, the JVM leading to sadness? Probably, and we wanna know that. So an example of when you explicitly set limits, and this is just, not failing, obviously, but this is just like, and again, this is a contrived example. You wouldn't always need to set these on the command line. You could obviously have them in your config, but just for purposes of not having to look at lots and lots of configs, lots and lots of YAML, you can say, we're going to have this policy that we have to have these specific limits set to run anything on our cluster. And that's, again, this is an example of, can you do this without conf test? Obviously. But if you put conf test into your, say, CI/CD pipeline, then you can throw out errors, hopefully before the bad configs are out there in production, paging you at 3 in the morning, making you sad. It's like, you get a lot cleaner experience like this. Okay, so I think hopefully the actionable takeaway here is, wow, there's a lot of really great open source projects in this space, and they probably need you to work on them. And if you're thinking like, oh, I'm not an open source contributor, like, don't worry. Like, you don't have to feel like you are anything specific. If you go to one of these repos, and I'll publish the slides after this, and all of these projects are up on GitHub, have repositories. If you go to one of these repos and just open an issue and say, I tried to do this, and this is the error I got, that's actually really helpful. Like, if you have an issue with how to reproduce it, I was using this version and this went wrong. I feel like sometimes getting started as, contributing to an open source project sounds like you need to do a ton of scaffolding, a ton of work, be really fancy. It's like, that's not actually true. Like, you can join the Cloud Native Adventure Brigade just by saying, I tried to use this and it did not work for me, and here's how. And like, that's actually more helpful than you would think, because if you think about it, people who are active contributors, maintainers on these projects are probably coming in with a set of assumptions that you don't have, and they can never get those newbie eyes on the project back again, ever. So like, those experience reports from people who are using one of these projects for the first time are something, that is value that only you can provide, which is kind of exciting. And it means that there's an adventure for you to join there. So I will say, this is one more thing about Microsoft, is that I literally have a Mac with a Microsoft asset tag on it, and my job is like Linux and open source, and that might mean that even though we live in the darkest timeline, clearly, there are some things in this timeline that are kind of awesome. And so I would encourage you, when you go back to your organizations, if they will let you work on open source, like say Comcast will, that is awesome. And if they are reluctant, just tell them, hey, you know what? The world has changed. We live in a world where open source is something that the Microsofts and Comcasts of the world are doing, and it's okay, and it's great, and it's a competitive advantage. There's some links here. Clearly, I'm podcasting too much if I'm thinking I want to say there are links in the show notes, but there are some links here. And just in terms of what we have here, a lot of the tools that I mentioned today are linked from the Deis Labs page. I want to point people to container.training, because that is a project that I gave 11 3-hour Kubernetes workshops last year based on this material, which Jerome Petazzoni created. And it's worth looking at if you kind of want to start from the Kubernetes the hard way sort of mindset or mentality, but it's also useful if you want to try to have something that you bring back to your organization. Because I feel like it's sometimes challenging when you go to a conference for 2 days and it's super fun. And then you go back to your organization and they're like, excellent, what did you learn for us? And they're like, and you're like, it was fun. So you can at least take container.training back to them and have something you can do. And there are also, by the way, trainings here. We are on day 2 of them. Perhaps, though, you can sneak in and catch up. So and they have repos on GitHub as well. And then there is a learning path Microsoft has a learning path that is not super vendor specific, that it takes you through Kubernetes. If you're like, people say, you keep using that word. What does that word mean? You can actually get yourself leveled up there. And then also the VS Code extension for Kubernetes. I wanted to link to that specifically because that's pretty useful. So with that, thanks. It's excellent getting a chance to talk to you. I know I am at time, but I think we'll actually talk to people because, spoiler alert, I'll be up here after lunch doing a podcast. So we'll get a chance to talk to people more then. All right, thank you.
Okay.